Well, good morning, empty nesters, and welcome. Welcome to virtual B18 and our empty nester Sunday school lesson for today. If my count is correct, and I'm pretty sure it is, this is week 13. Can you believe it? 13 weeks of video lessons. If you notice me laughing at myself, I have good reason. To offer a little bit of explanation, if you recall from my last video lesson, I told you about a time when I was shortly before I retired from AT&T where I was asked to make a video. And I spent several hours at a facility and it was a total bust. I was a failure. Well, as of this moment, this is take 19 of this lesson, and probably the fourth and hopefully final that I will have sent Jim Ragland and Gigi Kane. This is so hard for me to make a video. It's just something I don't like doing. So let's get back on point. It's good to be with you this morning, each of you. I'm not sure when it'll happen, if and when it'll happen, but I look forward to the day we can all be back in a real B18 instead of virtual B18. So let's get started. I am afraid that I'm not keeping up with my colleagues. I have no pretty background music this morning. I don't have any fancy intro. And I certainly have no toilet paper nostalgia to share with you, David. It's just me. So when Gigi sent out his email reminder a few weeks ago about to all those people like me that had lessons for this month, I had no idea what I wanted to teach on. But I felt like I knew at the time that I didn't want to do another Max Lucado lesson. I wanted to do something different. And then as I've watched the news over the last couple of weeks, the terrible news, I knew I wanted to do something different. In Carol's lesson on May 9th, she was talking about how her heart was breaking at the time. But on May 9th, Carol's heart was breaking because of all the issues surrounding COVID-19 and the coronavirus and people dying and getting sick and the healthcare workers, the stress that they were under, all of the above. But on May 9th, that's all we had going on. Like most of you, I thought I had enough on my plate just dealing with COVID-19. And then on Memorial Day, we had the brutal, unjustified murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. As bad as things were when we only had COVID-19, things got exponentially worse overnight. I'm sure like me and Kathy, everyone, all of you watched television, the news, were horrified, your heart ached with all of the civil unrest, the property that was damaged. It was just terrible. It's so very sad. As Carol said a few weeks ago, my heart aches. So, getting to my lesson, I have a habit of walking almost every day. Most times Kathy walks with me. And with the onset of summer and the heat coming on, we walk a lot earlier. But one morning, a week or so ago, I was walking by myself very early. And as I do often when I walk by myself, I talk to God. Uh, so on this day, I was talking to God, telling him I needed a topic for this morning's Sunday school lesson. It wasn't really a formal prayer because when I walk, I just have conversational discussion with God. But I have learned over the years, I don't think God cares how we talk to him. He just wants us to talk to him. So anyway, during my walk, I found myself thinking about everything that was going on in our world, in our country, in Dallas. I found myself thinking, what would Jesus do? This question, what would Jesus do, led me to today's topic. I know some of you may not agree with where I go with some of my topic today, but I've come to believe that what I'm going to discuss today is very important and relevant and timely. The topic centers on systemic racism that we have in our country today and have had for hundreds of years. We've heard this term systemic used by a lot of people in the news in the last couple of weeks. So I looked it up in the dictionary. It stands for, it means affecting the whole body. So in other words, systemic racism is something that is ingrained in our country. It's ingrained in our society. It's ingrained in our politics. And sadly, I think it's ingrained in us. So I hope my message this morning is received the way I hope it is. Doesn't sound right. So where do I get started? I found myself thinking back to my youth and how I grew up. As a kid, I grew up in a quiet, blue-collar neighborhood called Pleasant Grove. Kathy always referred to it as the Sticks, but we went to the same school, so her sticks weren't that far from my sticks. But anyway, when I was a kid in Pleasant Grove, I remember it was a great place to live, great place to grow up. I remember we never locked our doors. There was no crime. During the summer, Mom would push us out the door after we'd had breakfast, and we'd come back for lunch, and we'd come back for dinner. We might come back in between to get a Band-Aid, but we were outside playing all day long with friends, and we could go into anybody's house if we needed a drink of water. It was just a wonderful place to grow up and to live. We certainly didn't have any fancy technology in my home. I remember our first black and white television, and I don't think I could have imagined these 65-inch big screen televisions that we have today. I think it wasn't until I was 14 years old that we got rid of our party line. But there were also no blacks in my neighborhood, nor in any of the schools I went. In elementary school, junior high school, we called them junior high back then instead of middle school, and of course in high school. I never knew a black person. I never had a serious conversation with a black person until I went to college. Isn't that sad? But thinking back on Pleasant Grove, I do have a few not so good memories. I remember as a kid walking to the grocery store with my mom, and it was about a mile away, and we would walk to the A&P, the local A&P. And then back in the far right-hand corner of the store, there were water fountains. There were two of the water fountains. One was marked whites only, and one was marked coloreds only. As a little kid, I wondered and asked, why do we have two different water fountains? Why can't everybody just drink out of the same water fountain? I have a number of not so good memories like that from childhood. Back then, I think these signs were very intentional. The message was very clear. The message was that whites were better than blacks. Guys, right or wrong, this is how I grew up. What I knew about blacks as a kid, and maybe more importantly, what I didn't know about blacks as a kid, all came to me via my father, who, without a doubt, was a racist. Now, today's lesson is not about how I grew up, and it's certainly not about some of the many faults my father had. But I am a firm believer that most of us are a product of our environment. You want a good example of that? Just look at the murder of Ahmaud Arbery a few weeks ago by father and son. Boy, that acorn didn't fall far from the tree. I'm not sure how or why, but I learned at an early age, maybe it was divine intervention, I learned at an early age not to believe everything my dad said. It wasn't until I went off to college and then went to work for AT&T that my eyes began to open up and see things differently. Now, I don't mean to suggest that I had an epiphany. I'm not that naive. But I did start seeing things differently. I know today that there is no way that I can appreciate all the horrible things that white people have inflicted on black people over the years. And we still do. I do know that I never, ever had a discussion with my kids about how to act when, not if, they were pulled over by police. I never told them what to say, what not to say, how to act, how not to act. If If you talk to almost any black parents, they refer to this as the talk, a talk that they've all had with their kids, and especially young black boys. Things like where to place their hands on the steering wheel when they get pulled over, not if, but when they get pulled over by a policeman. How to put their hands out the window when, not if, they get pulled over by a cop. How to politely say yes sir and no sir. How to never reach for anything suddenly, such as reaching for your cell phone. You don't want any sudden moves with a policeman standing outside your door. In other words, never, ever give the policeman an excuse. Folks, I never had a conversation like that with Jeff or Stacy. And yet, I know many blacks, including grandparents, that have had the talk with their kids and their grandkids. Think about that. Isn't that sad? Isn't that tragic? Isn't that horrible? In a lot of ways, I feel lucky and blessed that I've had so many different and unique and wonderful people in my life. And Kathy and I have experienced a lot of neat jobs and job locations that have allowed us to grow in so many wonderful life experiences and gain so many important perspectives. But as I've watched the news this week, I've seen so many stories that just turn my stomach. So many things that I had just not paid attention to. I've just not thought about. I want to share a couple of stories with you that I have seen and read about over the last 2 weeks. I read a story about a man who came home from work after dark. He went in, he got his dog, the leash, a flashlight, and a poop bag, and took his dog for a walk. After he takes his dog for a walk, he comes back to the house. He goes in. He doesn't immediately turn on the lights, but he walks through the house with his flashlight on, supposedly let the dog out, put the leash up before he turns lights on. Somewhere in this process, police are called. The police show up. They bang on the door. 2 officers, guns drawn. The lady opens the door. She's got a little girl standing behind her, clutching at her legs. You can imagine the scene. They're petrified. They're scared to death. What's going on? She finally figures out that they want her neighbor next door. And fortunately, she says, listen, you want the house next door, you want my neighbor, but he's a black medical doctor. He just returns home after dark and he just walks his dog every night. Be careful. Think about that. Those 2 armed policemen bang on the doctor's door. If he hadn't turned the light on, he opens that door. Would that doctor be here today? Think about it. This is the America we live in. I saw another news article last week. Some of you may have seen it on television. It's about a nice looking, I thought relatively young, of course, look in the mirror, anybody's young these days, but a relatively young looking black professional. He's a retired FBI agent. And I didn't write down his title, but he had some fancy title. He was one of the top FBI agents in the North Texas area. Made you proud of him. But anyway, he was retired, and apparently he was driving in North Dallas in a white neighborhood. Police pulled him over. And so when the police came up to him, he asked, why did you pull me over? The policeman told him, you look suspicious. So the retired FBI agent, very politely, because he knows to do that, because as a kid he had to talk, explains to him what he was doing, where he was going, showed him his badge. Apparently when you're a retired FBI, you're still FBI and you still have a badge. So he showed him his badge, his credentials, his driver's license, and the policeman just abruptly turns around and walks away without so much as an apology for pulling him over. Think about that. Isn't that a shame? Isn't that a travesty? Isn't that terrible? he was profiled because he was driving in the wrong neighborhood. Guys, these are only 2 stories. Uh, there's thousands of them on the web. Uh, these stories didn't occur when in the 60s when I was a teenager. These stories occurred this year, 2020. Guys, this is America we live in. As some of y'all may have heard, Drew Brees, who plays for the New Orleans Saints, has been in the news this last week for some comments he said about the flag and kneeling. He has since apologized for those, but the thing that caught my attention was an op-ed, I think that's what they call them, an op-ed that his wife Brittany wrote. She wrote a long op-ed and basically said, "We are the problem." And she explained in there the we was white people are part of the problem because we haven't been listening. We haven't been paying attention. We have been silent during all of these racial inequities that are going on across our country. We have been silent. I have been shocked, as I know all of you have been, at all the rioting that's going on over the past couple of weeks. And by no means do I condone any of the property damage, the killing, the rioting that's been going on. But I found myself not completely surprised. Just how long can you beat down a large part of our society until some of them finally say we've had enough? I know most of the protesters were peaceful and trying to be peaceful, and it was a small fraction of them that were set out to do property damage and hurt people. But can you really blame the people that are protesting? I think all that is going on right now, all that's going on, that's not said right, is we've had enough. It's time for a change. Can we really blame them? And I'm sorry to bring this up, but with zero leadership coming out of Washington right now, including so many politicians with blind allegiance to the idiot in charge, I don't know how we're going to get out of this. We as Christians, we as people of faith have to find a voice. We have to do something differently. We have to fight for what is right for everybody. So this leads me back to the question I thought of while we were walking. What would Jesus do? Would he grab a sign and join a peaceful protest? I think he would. Would he advocate change to the leaders that are responsible for addressing issues like this? I know he would. I don't pretend to know everything that Christ would do, but I think it's fair to say he would not be silent, hoping somebody else would deal with it. As people of faith, it's up to us to no longer be silent, to stand up for what's right, to help defend our friends and neighbors. Guys, I don't know what the right answer is, but Jesus got upset with the money changers in the temple. I think he would be upset today with the apathy, with the ignorance, with the divisiveness that we seem to see all over our country. I know Christ would pray a lot, as we should, but I don't think he would be silent. We should not be silent. I think Christ is challenging us today not to be silent. So, as most of you know, I taught a men's Bible study about 10 years ago. Jim and Earl remember this. During those 10 years, we studied a lot of different material. Somewhere along the way, we used a couple of Bible studies by Tony Dungy. I'd like to think these books and these videos and the study that we had gave me some special insight into Tony. I think he's a very, very special person. special as a coach, special as a man, special as a husband and a father, and certainly special as a mentor and a Christian. Tony was the first black coach of the NFL to win a Super Bowl. Most of you don't know this, but there was a time I was also responsible for the men's UMM, and there was a time when Ron Henderson and I were entertaining the thought of trying to get Tony to come to Collin County. We felt like at the time that he could fill up our sanctuary many times over if we were to invite men of faith from all the different churches across Collin County, that we could have filled our sanctuary up many, many times. I've often regretted that we never were able to pull that off. I think it would have been fabulous. So now I want to share a short video that involves Tony and an interview by Mike Tirico. It was done about a day and a half to 2 days after George Floyd's death. And you'll see by some of the things that Mike is asking that it's clearly before some of the major rioting started. As an aside, Mike Tirico is a black sportscaster who now works for NBC. But for over 10 years, Mike worked as an NFL play-by-play announcer on Monday Night Football, I think at ESPN. The video is not the best of quality, I'll tell you that, but the audio and the message is. Please watch and listen. I'll be back shortly.
Police involved there. Obviously, a lot of consternation about arrests that will be made at some point, according to some, might be made at some point, the delay in doing such. Tweets from the president, violence in Minneapolis, looting, fires, all of that stuff. It just rose to the level of there's someone on our team who can add great perspective on that for all of us, and the perspective of sports in a world where protest, race, and other issues come to the surface. And that person is Tony Dungy. So about an hour or so ago, I had a chance to sit down and visit with Coach by tape. And here's our conversation on some history, some perspective, and some context for what we've seen out of the last 48 hours from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Tony Dungy joins us. No better perspective to get when things are outside of the lines of sports than the perspective of Coach Dungy. Tony, you're a proud Minnesota Golden Gopher from your college days, so you know Minnesota very well and spent some great time there during the Super Bowl a few years ago. I just want to hear your thoughts as you see the images that we've seen from the Twin Cities over the last couple of days.
No, it's tough. Boy, my heart is just breaking right now. I spent 8 years there, 4 years as a student, 4 years as an assistant coach with the Vikings. My brother still lives in the Twin Cities area. And it's just hard to watch this. You see people who are frustrated, they're upset, maybe not handling things in the best way, but very frustrated. And they've seen this kind of cycle, and we've got to do something to not only give them hope, but to restore love and respect to everybody. And that's what I'm praying for.
Tony, you grew through the 60s, living in Michigan too, growing up about an hour or so west of Detroit. So protests have been a part of our American history. And sometimes they just feel so wrong when you see them because it's an expression and it's not the healthiest expression to change the good. When you see protests still going on here in 2020, take us back to the 60s and what America was like at a very difficult time in our country then.
I remember being young and growing up. I remember when Dr. King got killed. And you walk outside and you're just, boy, I can't believe this. And then you go back in and watch TV and you see all the places all around the country with similar type things here. Burning, looting, just frustration, anger coming out. And I guess what I go back to, Mike, is a couple of years ago on the show, we had a lot of young men from the NFL who were protesting peacefully. And they were taking a knee during the national anthem. And the thought then was, hey, let's hear from people. Let's find out what's going on. And I don't think we treated it that way. And so now you get this, well, how can we react? How can we respond? That didn't work. And you're seeing anger come out. And anger is not the way to solve things. It really isn't.
Tony, you have some young boys who you are a great leader, mentor, dad too. So you see this firsthand. This is a very video-driven age. And so we see the images of George Floyd and the moments before he was killed. And we see the press conference where there's no action taken at that moment yesterday with the 4 policemen who were involved in the George Floyd incident. Do you think the fact that there's such readily available and socially shared video helps inflame these situations a lot quicker than it used to happen?
Yeah. No, it definitely does. You can see it almost instantaneously. You see the visual picture. You don't have to have someone describe it to you. And it's hurtful. And to explain to my young boys, hey, this is wrong. But in the words of my dad, what are we going to do to make the situation better? How can we help? And there are people who feel like the only way I can help is to show my anger and frustration. And that is part of it. We have to have these voices heard. But we also have to do it in a respectful way. We've got to show love to everybody and figure out how we can move forward. I have friends on the police force here in Tampa. My uncle was the assistant chief of police in Detroit, Michigan, in those 60s that you're talking about, 60s and 70s, a rough time. So I know we can't point the finger at every single policeman. We can't just blanketly say the police department does this, police do that. We have to look at individual cases, and we have to figure out a way that we can get some response and some satisfaction to the families of George Floyd and to people who are saying, no one hears our voice.
Tony, you can speak to frustration and anger and how to handle it. If we go back in time, you were a terrific quarterback, and as your entree to the NFL happened, it was you're going to be a defensive back. And there was a lot of the black quarterback stigma that you had to deal with directly. And that you were frustrated and angry about that. How'd you deal with that? And how can we teach a lesson to younger generations of how to protest effectively and not do it in a way that it does even more damage to people's businesses, to people's lives, and to cities while still trying to get some change in the real world?
Yeah, no, that's what really hurts, Mike. I'm very familiar with that neighborhood in South Minneapolis and driven by there hundreds of times. There's a lot of minority community leaders there. There's minority businesses. And to see that area just get taken down like this, it's very sad. So how do you get your voice heard? How do you express your feelings? How do you come up with solutions and do it in a way that moves forward? And that's the frustrating thing. But that's what we've got to come up with. That's what people, I think, have to understand. My dad used to tell me all the time, what are you going to do to make it better? You go back to those 1972 and 75, and I'm in college playing against Warren Moon. And I'm leading the Big Ten in passing. Warren's leading the Pac-10 in passing. And neither one of us gets drafted. What are you going to do to make the situation better? Well, I chose to go to the NFL and see if I could make a career and become a coach. Warren went to the Canadian League and showed people that he was good enough to play and came back and had a Hall of Fame career. So I think you've got to look at different ways to strike out and do it in a positive way, make a difference, have your voice heard. And it does get frustrating. There's no question about it, but frustration can't be the driving emotion.
And there are still not solutions to the issues. The Rooney Rule conversation was just rich again in the National Football League this offseason. I want to ask you about athletes. You talked about Colin Kaepernick, other players with their kneeling protest, and we know the conversation that brought up. What's the role of the athlete, Tony? I'm thinking of a guy like Kirk Cousins, and I don't mean to put any onus on him at this point, but here's a guy who grew up in Michigan, right? He played for the Washington Redskins. He's only been in Minnesota a few years, but he becomes one of the most visible people. And immediately, people want sports and the athletes to speak up and use their voice. They may not know what Minneapolis is all about. They've only been there 2-3 years. What's the role of the professional athlete in these cities in times of crisis, especially when it's involving race?
I think we do have a responsibility. I know when I came to the Steelers, Mr. Rooney, our owner, he talked about not just playing football for the Steelers, but being part of the community. And being part of the community means stepping up at times when we need it. Yes, it means community service, but sometimes it can be speaking up and saying, you know what, people, we need to stay calm. We need to stay peaceful. But leadership, we need to listen. We need to listen to these voices. I saw a tweet from Zach Ertz. I saw one from Carson Wentz. I've seen one from J.J. Watt. guys saying, "Hey, we have a voice," and that's awesome. You applaud that. That's what these guys, to me, Mike, were doing. We did a piece on Kenny Stills and Mike Thomas in Miami, and they were responding to something that happened in Minneapolis. Kenny Stills has ties to Minneapolis. Philando Castile was shot by a police officer 4 years ago. And that was part of what they wanted to get across. And that's what they told us on our show. Hey, we need to be a voice for those who may not have as strong a voice as we do. And I think that's very appropriate for our sports figures.
You were in that position to be a leader of men. And when you got up to address your Bucks teams, your Colts teams, white, black, mix of religions, mix of political beliefs, yet you had to bring them together. Does sports still do a good job of bridging the racial gap, or perhaps as good a job as some of the other walks of life in America in 2020?
I think it absolutely does, because you have communication. You have guys sitting in the same locker room and saying, and unfortunately they can't do that now because of this pandemic, but it would be very, very awesome to have guys in the locker room discussing this situation right now. What can we do? How can we, as a 53-man group, help make the situation better? If the Minnesota Vikings were right there in Minneapolis right now, it would be some awesome discussion between those leaders. And in a sports locker room, you can have that back and forth together with mutual respect. And that's what I think we need.
And can you, in the last few seconds, coach the coaches out there, whether they're college, high school, pro coaches, who are collecting via Zoom, via FaceTime, conversations with their teams, because a lot of this virtual stuff is happening. What advice would you give them in terms of addressing these issues with their players and with their teams at a moment like this?
Definitely come together, definitely address it, hear every voice, and try not to react with emotion and anger, but react with the thought going forward. How can we build respect in our country? How can we build respect for one another and go forward? How can we make things better?
You are always there at a moment's notice with guidance and wisdom. I know you never really love it when we call you coach, but you coach a lot of us through some tough times and help us understand things. So thank you, Coach. We appreciate your time, and have a safe weekend with your family, Tony.
Thank you, Mike. Great being on with you, and we just have to pray for our country.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.
Welcome back. As I said a few moments ago, the video quality was a bit on the weak side, but the content was on target. Maybe someday I'll develop a lesson or two from one of Tony's books. They were clearly designed for men, but I think everybody in our class would love them and benefit from them. So what did you think of Tony's answers to Mike's questions? So at this point, if I were standing up in front of you, this is where I would just pause and wait until I got some of you to start talking. Gigi taught me that. But we can't really do that, can we? So instead, let's go back and visit the question that I found myself asking God, or God asking me, on my walk a few weeks ago. What would Jesus do? First, I'm pretty certain Jesus would not support violence. He would not support destruction or mayhem, and certainly not the killing of police officers or anybody else. If I had to summarize into one word what I believe Christ stands for, and y'all know what it is, it's love. After all, didn't Jesus tell us to love your neighbor as yourself? Something that we're obviously not doing. So the question is, how do we do this? I don't pretend to know the answer. I don't pretend to understand everything that we must do. But I do think that as Christians, we're called upon to no longer be silent. We cannot expect change if we don't advocate for change. I'm not sure how to do this, and I may ponder and reflect and think about this question for a long, long time. I hope I do. You know, we're going to have COVID around for a long time. As I've thought about this issue of some of the racial inequities and the problems that we have going on in our society, I'm not at all sure that the racial inequities is far greater issue than COVID. Can you imagine if our country, if corporate America would invest a fraction of the energy that they're investing right now to solve the COVID issue, if they would invest a fraction of the energy to get behind this racial issue, we could solve this issue in our lifetime. I think that ought to be a priority. I think it ought to be one of the most important things for our politicians can do is to get behind this and let's solve this issue once and for all. We have a responsibility. I want to paraphrase something that Corey said last Sunday. We cannot give power to someone else expecting them to solve all of our issues. In other words, we have responsibility. As Tony was closing his video, he quoted his dad. In fact, he quoted his dad a couple of times on the video. And his dad would always ask Tony, what are you going to do to make the situation different? My challenge today to myself, my challenge today to you, is what do we need to learn so that we can better appreciate all of these racial issues that are going on around us? And then what am I going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? So as I wrap up, I know this was certainly not a traditional Sunday school lesson. I know I touched on some sensitive and difficult issues. I know that some of you may not completely agree with my perspectives, but I think it's long overdue that we talk about issues like this. I think I agree with Brittany Drees. We're part of the problem. So my plea to all of us is for us to no longer be silent on the issue of race, to keep an open mind, to try to see things from somebody else's perspective. In other words, to try to walk in their shoes, which is impossible for us to do, but we have to try. And as we do this, we should ponder what Christ would have us do. Amen. I hope all of you have a really good week. You know, almost every night between 5:30 and 6, I watch Lester Holt. And as he ends his broadcast a few moments before 6 o'clock, he always says, stay safe and take care of one another. So I want to send that same message to each of you. Be safe and take care of one another. Until we can come together again, see you next time.